They got millions at Grandpa's funeral. I got one plane ticket. While they counted houses and stocks, I unfolded an envelope with 6 words that didn't make sense then, but would change everything I thought I knew about love, inheritance, and him. The ticket didn't send me to money. It sent me to a place where a promise was still waiting. I didn't leave the study right away. The air still held after voices, the faint perfume of a cousin who hugged me too hard while her eyes searched over my shoulder for the lawyer. The clock above the bookcase ticked the way clocks tick when the rich are deciding who they'll become next. I stood alone with a paper cup cooling in my hands and looked at the old map above Grandpa's desk, the one with the small pin stuck near a gray-blue coast. Nobody ever asked why the pin was there. He would have told them if they'd been asking for more than directions to their own names. On the porch, winter pressed its face against the glass. I opened the envelope, and 6 words leaned forward the way truth does when it knows you'll recognize it, even if you don't understand it yet. Find the tree. It's waiting still. I traced the curve of his handwriting with my thumb, until my skin learned the shape of each letter. The ticket felt like a dare and a welcome at the same time. Back inside, people had already begun the inventory dance. A drawer opened. A tin of paper clips lifted like treasure. A silver pen passed from one hand to another with a promise to put it right back. My Aunt Marie asked if I was okay without waiting to hear the answer. She squeezed my shoulder and told me travel builds character like character was a muscle you could schedule between flights. I said I'd be gone a few days and watched her eyebrows calculate my absence into her convenience. I packed quietly. The house had a guest room that had learned my name over holidays, and the kind of emergencies families fabricate to keep from saying what's really wrong. I took the scarf that still smelled faintly of cedar, the sweater he'd sworn made me look like a professor even when my bank account argued, the notebook I'd kept empty on purpose for the kind of words that shouldn't have to fight for space. I slid the envelope into the inside pocket of my coat, where important things rest near the heartbeat that keeps choosing them. I slept in pieces. Memory woke me 3 times and delivered the same scene, his hands on the cabin table, fingers tapping a rhythm he used when he was deciding whether to say something or let the room learn it on its own. When the alarm asked, I got up without bargaining. The sky outside wore a color that only exists when light is deciding which room to enter first. I thanked him in a whisper and left before gratitude could be mistaken for permission to stay. Airports at dawn are a museum of human attempts. People hurry in shoes that weren't designed for running, clutching bags full of objects that pretend to be security. I moved slowly, not out of rebellion but because I didn't want to confuse velocity with purpose. The agent scanned the ticket and smiled with tired eyes. "Maine," she said like a small blessing. "You'll need a good coat." I told her I had one from a man who never bought anything he didn't intend to keep. The plane lifted and the city shrank into a diagram of ideas that looked tidy only from a distance. Above the clouds, the sun made a promise it has kept longer than any dynasty. I let the hum of the engines wash the room in sameness and closed my eyes on the story everyone else was telling about what had just happened. The poor granddaughter gets a pity trip. People like tidy stories because they fit in pockets. This one didn't. Portland greeted me with wind that didn't pretend. A sky the color of a working harbor. An air that tasted like salt had an opinion. The rental car clerk slid keys across a counter nicked by 1,000 transactions, and said my name in the friendly way of people who rent you things they know you'll give back. I drove toward the water because the body sometimes knows a point on the compass without having to ask a map. I passed houses that wore winter with dignity, porches shouldering snow, mailboxes practicing patience. A woman in a red knit hat marched a dog with the determined joy of someone who has decided to love a day no matter what it tries. A fisherman in rubber boots hosed the deck of a boat that had carried more than its weight in other people's dinners. The town thinned and the road stretched and the trees began repeating themselves like a prayer they'd learned years ago and still meant. The turnoff appeared the way right turns often do, less like an announcement, more like a memory finding its mouth. Gravel pinged the undercarriage. Pine boughs nodded me through as if to say that whoever you are when you arrive is not a requirement for who you will be when you leave. The cabin waited without theatrics. A single window blinked light at me. The steps sighed when I climbed them, but they held. Inside, the room recognized me. That's how it felt. I stood just inside the door, the way you do when you're deciding if you should knock even after you've been invited in. Dust lifted and turned the sun into handwriting over the table. The chair under the window still knew how to listen. On the mantel, a jar of nails, a small level, a folded scrap of paper beneath a stone. I slid the stone aside. In his neat block letters, if you arrive tired, sit. If you arrive hungry, boil water. If you arrive lost, go say hello to the tree first. I set my bag down. Tired can wait when instructions are this kind. I walked out the back door and there it was, taller than memory, older than the argument I'd been losing with myself. The tree's trunk split the way a heart sometimes must. Not broken, just widened to make room for what life brought. The bark wrote in ridges a poem about time that only hands can read. The branches spoke fluent weather. I put my palm against it and the cold went through my skin and into my bones and quieted a noise I hadn't noticed until it stopped. At the base, a flat stone like a lid. I knelt and lifted. A tin box waited, stubbornly itself against years of seasons that had asked it to become something else. I brushed off the dirt the way you wipe crumbs from a friend's collar. The lid stuck and then gave a small sound that ended one chapter and began another. Letters waited, tied with twine that had been replaced more than once by the same hands. Each envelope addressed the same way, to whoever still remembers. I smiled. He always wrote for the person he hoped would show up, not the one he feared would. The top letter wore the year 1963 like a badge earned by surviving it. The ink had softened at the loops where he leaned into the words. I carried the box to the table because some reading requires a surface that has already held decisions. I boiled water because sometimes boiling water is a prayer with steam. The first letter opened like a door you've oiled just enough to make the hinge honest. He wrote about arriving with a truck that coughed like an old smoker, and a pocket full of reasons to sell before he'd even built. He wrote about swinging a hammer too hard and splitting a board, then learning that gentler force often lasts longer. He wrote about my grandmother, though he didn't call her that yet, only the girl who burns things until they taste like caramel and insists that's a recipe. I read until the tea cooled into a mirror and showed me a face I was still learning to claim. Letter after letter, years stacked like wood seasoned right. Some years smelled of sawdust and satisfaction. Some reeked of fear. He confessed to a pride that came in sneaky shoes, to a tightness in his chest on Thursdays he couldn't name until he admitted it was grief disguised as indigestion, to the stubbornness that cost him a neighbor's friendship and the apology that earned it back. He wrote things men don't say out loud when they are busy teaching the world they are made of tools and weather. He wrote them to a future he trusted. Afternoon leaned into evening without asking permission. I lit the small lamp on the counter with a flick that sent light into corners that had been politely waiting. The next letter was written on paper different than the rest, thinner, almost translucent, as if the day had required a lighter touch. He wrote about the day my mother was born and the terror of holding promises with a pulse. He wrote about the year money shouted louder than quiet and the whisper that outlasted it. He admitted to selling something he should have kept and keeping something he should have given away. The admission felt like a man laying down weight without expecting applause. I paused at a letter addressed not to whoever still remembers, but to you if you are mine. The corner had a grease smudge where a thumb had thought while holding it. The date was 5 winters before he went still in a church full of polished shoes. I let my fingers rest on it a second, the way you do with an object that asks for reverence instead of urgency. Before I opened it, I stood and stretched the hours out of my back. The floor answered with a small creak that sounded like laughter. I walked to the window and looked at the tree's silhouette holding the last of the light like a lantern only it knew how to use. I thought of the house back home full of satisfied owners measuring themselves against numbers, and I felt a tenderness for them that surprised me. They had won a contest he had never signed up for. I opened the letter. If you're reading this, you found the right place for the right reason. The money will go where it's needed least. Let them have it. What you need can't be bought. There's a key beneath the north root. Use it to open what's waiting inside the cabin. That's your inheritance. If you are mine, you will understand why. My body recognized those words before my mind caught up. I pulled on my coat without putting the letter down. Outside, the cold felt clean. I circled the trunk. The north root presented itself like a loyal friend. Steady, available, not loud about it. I dug with my fingers first and then with a flat stick, old earth packing itself under my nails like a credential. The key was small brass, the kind that had never learned to be anything but a key. I closed my fist around it and felt ownership bow to stewardship the way it's supposed to. Inside, I knew exactly where to go. Behind the painting of that gray-blue ocean, a safe. He'd hung the painting slightly crooked on purpose to see who cared enough to straighten it. I had straightened it every time since I was 10. The key turned and the lock agreed with a sigh that sounded like relief. No jewelry. No stacks of bills with the breath still trapped between them, like relief. No jewelry. No stacks of bills with the breath still trapped between them. Folders. Each with a name. Each with a story paperclip to an address. A widow whose porch sagged. A veteran whose roof leaked into the room where he kept his medals in a shoebox. A teacher who spent Saturdays tutoring kids at the library, while her water heater coughed warnings nobody else heard. A mechanic who charged single mothers half and then paid the other half himself by skipping dinner. Deeds. Some signed already. Some waiting for signatures that would be earned by showing up with a toolbox and a promise. Receipts for lumber. Handwritten lists of measurements that fit rooms I hadn't met yet. A ledger in his hand that didn't track profits, only progress. Porch brace. South beam. Paint. Forgiving white. Ask Miss Flores about the jasmine, does she want to keep it? He wrote questions in the margins and answers beside them in another color, like a conversation with time. At the bottom, one last page, his everyday paper, the kind he kept near the phone for grocery lists and calling back people who didn't sound like themselves. Wealth is what you leave in people, not what you leave to them. If you found this, don't thank me. Build the next one. You'll know where. P.S. Check the shoebox on the top shelf. Not money. Better. I laughed because even his instructions made space for humor. The shoebox held photographs and a recipe card in my grandmother's slanted script for a cake she called Make Do Miracle. Flour smudged the corner like a fingerprint from a good day. Underneath, maps with circles drawn around neighborhoods that news anchors only arrived at when sirens had already told the story. I sat on the floor with my back against the safe and the folder open on my knees. The lamp hummed. The cabin breathed. The world outside made the sounds worlds make when they're doing their job. I took out my notebook and wrote the first sentence I didn't want to forget. He turned money into roofs and rooms into conversations and strangers into neighbors. My inheritance is the instruction to continue without making it about myself. I dialed the first number because first steps become stories if you give them a job. It rang 4 times. A woman answered on the inhale, the way people answer when they've stopped expecting good news. Ms. Rivera? I said, and my voice chose gentleness without asking me. My name is Elise. I'm calling about your porch. Silence held a hand to its ear. It's still standing, she said carefully, like the porch could hear us and get ideas. Why? Because it should be safer than that, I said. I can be there tomorrow. We'll bring braces and better wood and a question about jasmine. She didn't laugh, but something lighter moved through the line. Who sent you? She asked, and I looked at his handwriting and said the truest version. A man who believed doors should swing honest and roofs shouldn't make you pray for mercy, I said. He left instructions. I'm following them. I could hear her decide to trust me. Decisions make a sound when they're kind. I called the veteran next. His voice had gravel and gratitude in equal measures. He asked if I charged extra for same-day miracles. I told him I charge in cookies if he bakes and in stories if he doesn't. He said he had both, but the stories were better warmed. By the time I set the phone down, my hands had stopped shaking. Work will do that to a body. I wrote times and addresses on the map. He'd left and drew lines between them like the town was a constellation that had been waiting for someone to notice which stars belonged together. I hung my coat by the door and laughed when I realized I'd used a nail he'd driven at an angle on purpose because the stud behind the wall had insisted. I washed the cup. I wiped the table. I made the bed with corners he would have approved. I turned out the light and let the dark have the room for a while, trusting it would give it back in the morning. Sleep came like a friend who knows where you keep the spare key. I dreamt of hammers learning to whisper and trees that could read letters if you pressed them against the bark. When I woke, the world was already halfway through making coffee out of light. I opened the door and the air handed me clarity. The tree stood right where it had always stood, unbothered by my tendency to narrate. I touched it and thanked it for holding a man's habit of writing to the future. I thought about my family 1,000 miles away, measuring their love by appraisals. I forgave them a little, not because they deserved it yet, but because forgiveness makes room for the work. The day began in lists and lengths. I measured the porch in my head while tying my boots. I pictured the veteran's roof and felt where it would complain. I saw the teacher's basement and knew which kind of laughter would make the job go faster. I packed the car with what the cabin already had, a toolbox that knew the names of its tools, a coil of rope that had never failed, a level with a bubble that had taught 3 generations the difference between almost and right. On the table I left a note for the room. Back before dark. Save my place. I didn't know why I wrote it like that. Maybe because some places learn your name and you want to teach them how to call it. As I drove down the gravel, I caught myself checking the rearview mirror not to see who might be following, but to make sure the cabin didn't feel abandoned. It didn't. It felt like a light left on in a house you can trust. I stopped at the hardware store on the edge of town. The bell over the door made a sound that did not announce, only welcomed. A man with hands that had known winter asked if I needed help or if I enjoyed the ritual of pretending I didn't. I told him I needed braces and screws and the kind of advice you give people who are new but not lost. He smiled like he liked my answer. He added a box of nails I hadn't asked for and said they were better than the kind I thought I needed. I asked how he knew. He said he'd read my coat and my face and the list in my hand and found the truth between them. He asked how long I'd be in town. I said long enough to fix a few things. He nodded, the way men nod when something they care about is being said in a language they respect. He rang me up and put a small pencil behind my ear like a blessing. Write measurements like you're writing a letter, he said. Somebody's going to read them later. The first address was a small house with a porch that sagged like a tired knee. Ms. Rivera waited in the doorway with arms crossed in the way people cross them when they are holding themselves together. Her eyes softened when she saw the braces in the truck bed. I introduced myself to the Jasmine first because sometimes you have to greet what was there before you were. We worked quietly at the beginning, the way strangers turn into neighbors. She told me where the porch groaned in the morning and laughed at herself for knowing what wood sounds like when it has complaints. I told her I like homes that talk. They keep you from pretending. We lifted the beam with the jack I'd found under the cabin workbench and slid the new brace in like a tooth that fit better than the old one it replaced. The level's bubble center punched its little window, and we both exhaled like we'd been holding our breath since late October. When the last screw bit, she put a hand over her mouth and then removed it because joy shouldn't have to muffle itself. She brought out 2 mugs of something sweet and hot and called me Mija and said it like an invitation I'd earned by sweating in the right places. Who sent you? She asked again, this time not because she needed to know, but because gratitude likes proper addressing. A man who left me a map with names instead of treasure, I said. He taught me that the only thing you should bury is a key under a tree that knows your story. She nodded. Then he was a good man, she said, and the porch agreed by not creaking when we stepped back inside. The veteran's roof was less polite. It tested my balance and my resolve and my ability to listen for the difference between a board that can be reasoned with and a board that requires replacement. He told me stories while I worked, not about war, but about the morning after he came home when he couldn't decide whether to make the bed and decided yes because it looked like a future. He handed up shingles the way you hand up truths. Steady, deliberate, no need to shout. When the last nail went in, he saluted the sky with his hand over his heart and laughed at himself, and I laughed with him because sometimes you have to respect both ceremony and the person performing it. By dusk, I had learned the town's corners and the cadence of 3 different doorbells. I had a list of what the teacher needed and a promise from the hardware store man to hold 2 rolls of insulation and the good kind of tape. I had a smear of tar on my cheek and a slice on my thumb that I cleaned with a tissue from the glove compartment, and the kind of bravery you get from knowing the work is worth small blood. I went back to the cabin in the blue that keeps secrets kindly. I turned on the lamp and the room lifted its head like a dog whose person has returned. I set the receipts in a pile and wrote notes in the margins of his ledger, dates, names, small victories. I left space between lines because I've learned generosity needs room to expand. I ate standing at the counter because hunger sometimes prefers the company of exhaustion. I washed the plate not because anyone was watching, but because self-respect leaves evidence. Before sleep, I wrote him a letter I couldn't send. I found the tree. It was waiting the way you said. I'm leaving different kinds of wealth in rooms you would have liked. They say I got nothing. You and I know better. I folded the page and slid it beneath the tin box like letters like to sleep near cousins. The wind picked up and the cabin laughed softly in its joints. The tree outside wrote shadows on the floor that read like verses. I lay still and let the room teach me how to belong. Morning would come with more names and measurements and ladders. The map on the table had added 2 lines while I wasn't looking. Work had begun rearranging me into the person he'd addressed without using my name. I closed my eyes on the 6 words that had opened this door and let them become a lullaby. Find the tree. It's waiting still. They were instructions, yes, but they were also a mercy. They were how he told me that inheritance is the work you can't wait to wake up to. And I slept the way people sleep when they've chosen a direction and the road has agreed. Morning arrived like it had been waiting on the porch. The cold had that clean honesty that makes a person choose who they will be before coffee. I chose the version of myself that shows up with a pencil behind her ear and a list already listening. The cabin answered by giving me everything a room can give when it wants you to succeed: light, warmth, a table that does not wobble when plans are being made. The map became a compass I could hold in both hands. Names turned into addresses into doorways that opened because hope had been whispered ahead of me by a man who understood how to make generosity travel. I learned which streets turned slick first, which corners the wind kept for itself, which driveways belonged to people who apologize for the mess as if kindness cared about arrangement. The teacher's basement smelled like old paper and persistence. She had stacked books in neat towers that wobbled with dignity, and every stack had a scrap of paper tucked under it with a student's name like a foundation. The heater coughed like a smoker trying to keep secrets. I measured the walls while she told me about Tuesday afternoons when 3 children learned the multiplication table on the same breath. Insulation slid into the cavities like reassurance. Tape pressed down like a promise you intend to keep on bad days too. When I finished, the room exhaled a different kind of air, and the teacher smiled without putting a hand over her mouth to hide it. She offered ginger snaps and I took 2 because refusing small joy does not make you holy. I learned to carry a small box of screws in my coat pocket the way some people carry mints. Changed the way I looked at the world. Everywhere I went, I asked what could be fastened back to what it had lost. Hinges stopped choosing sides. Cupboard doors admitted the war was over. Fences that had learned to lean decided to stand straight if it meant children could keep their knees unbloodied for one more afternoon. I did not call any of it charity. I called it the obvious thing, which is another name for love once it has been taught how to work. At the hardware store, the clerk started keeping a ledger with my name on it, not because I asked for credit, but because he recognized momentum when it walked in with sawdust in its hair. He underlined certain items with a pencil that had been sharpened with a knife, and wrote little notes in the margins so I wouldn't have to ask twice. Better screws for wet wood. Use a brace here if the grain fights you. Don't argue with oak, coax it. He asked me nothing about my family because he could tell the work was the story I wanted to tell just now. Calls came back between hammer swings. Voices that had been bracing for a different world found me and tried on relief carefully to see if it fit. A veteran left a message telling me the roof did not complain in the night for the first time in years, and he slept through the hour that used to wake him. Ms. Rivera said her granddaughter bounced on the porch and the boards held, and both of them laughed until the jasmine shook like a bell. The teacher texted a picture of 3 children reading in the basement with their coats on the backs of chairs instead of on their bodies, because the room had decided to be kind. In the middle of all that small repair, wealth tried to locate me. It did not come as apology. It came as convenience. A cousin called and said the cabin could be worth more if I sold it before the season turned, while buyers still felt brave, while interest rates were still learning to be polite. He said it like a favor. He said travel builds character and character gets tired without cash. He said a lot of things money likes to hear when it's looking in a mirror. I listened until he thought I agreed. Then I said I had already been paid in roof pitch and porch braces and the sound a window makes when it decides to be useful again. He laughed like I had told a joke. I let him. The family group chat populates itself even if you do not feed it. Photos of keys, of signatures, of champagne glasses near paperwork. Houses with views. Driveways with declarations. I put my phone face down and slid it under a ledger that valued different columns. Later, an aunt sent a photo of a chandelier and asked what I had gotten. I looked at my hands, at the small cuts full of the honest sting that means progress, at a note on the table in his steady handwriting. I typed that I had gotten a door that swings honest and a town that has started to remember itself. I did not press send because not every answer belongs to the person who asks. Between houses, I began stopping by the library because I needed a table that had seen other people learn. The librarian wore cardigans in colors that made gray days behave. She pointed me to a corner with outlets and a window that looked across to a row of mailboxes practicing endurance. I spread the deeds, his notes, my lists. The map gained arrows and circles and little stars in the places where someone would tell a story later that began with the sentence, "The day the cold stayed outside." A boy with a backpack too big for his shoulders sat across from me one afternoon, opened a notebook, and practiced writing his name in letters that had not yet decided who they wanted to be. He glanced at my papers like a person noticing a secret without wanting to steal it. I asked him nothing. He kept scribbling, and then he started drawing my pencil and the way it balanced behind my ear like a flag. His picture made me look braver than I felt. He tore the page and slid it across to me without looking up. I folded it and put it between two deeds like a guarantee. The tree behind the cabin became a ritual. I visited before supper and placed my palm against the bark until the day's noises stopped trying to tell me who I was. I told it the names I had learned and the measurements that had mattered and the places where the wood refused and then relented. I told it the joke the veteran made about the roof saluting the sky. I told it how the teacher's basement loosened its shoulders. Sometimes I said nothing and just listened to a trunk that had survived more storms than I could apologize for. If a person can be adopted by a tree, I was. One evening I found a fresh envelope under the twine in the tin box. A different paper than the old letters, whiter, undimmed. The date was the year he fell, and did not tell anyone the bruise hurt because he didn't want fuss. The handwriting had steadied itself against late age and chosen to be clear. If you are reading this, I am probably quieter than the last time you saw me. The day will come when people mistake what I owned for what I accomplished. Let them. We do not correct every misunderstanding. We build the next right thing and let the work explain us. I did not send you to money. I sent you to a place that remembers your name when the world has finished calling roll. Do not sell it. You will know why when your hands learn the walls. I held the to a place that remembers your name when the world has finished calling roll. Do not sell it. You will know why when your hands learn the walls. I held the page like you hold someone's face when they are saying something important for the last time without calling it the last time. Then I put it back under the twine so the next version of me would find it again on a day she needed reminding. The coastal map at the bottom of the safe tugged at my sleeve while I slept. It had circles farther out, small towns stitched to this one by the same stubborn shoreline, places where roofs would say the same sentence in another accent. I drove to the first circle on a morning when fog taught the road humility. A cafe with a sign that had been hand-painted in a hurry sold me a coffee that tasted like the owner had prayed while grinding the beans. A woman at the counter said there was a widower whose steps ate ankles in the rain. She pointed with her chin the way directions are given in communities where everyone already knows you are trying to help. His house sat on a hill that had not wanted to be climbed but had allowed itself to be anyway. The steps had become opinions. Wood chewed by weather. Nails that had let go in protest. I did the arithmetic of risers and treads until the staircase admitted I was the kind of person it could be wrong in front of. When I finished, the man stood beside me and looked down without moving and said maybe he would go to the market on Tuesdays again. I asked him if he needed anything in particular. He said oranges. I wrote oranges on my hand and in the corner I drew a dot the way my grandfather had when he wanted a list to look like it belonged to a person. Word began to travel by methods you cannot trace with a finger. Church bulletins without names. A little box by the cash register at the feed store where people leave each other jobs and casseroles. Lips at mailboxes. A clerk who tells a customer to ask for the woman with the pencil and the map. The librarian made a small stack of books I did not ask for. One about wood movement, one about letters people wrote when they remembered who they were, one about lighthouses and the way they are maintained in the off-season. She checked them out on my card and put a sticky note on the cover that said, "Return whenever truth allows." The cabin changed too. Not in its bones but in its habits. I started a ledger of my own beside his. Not to overwrite, but to keep pace. I wrote the small kindnesses that did not fit in receipts. The boy's drawing, the teacher's ginger snaps, the veteran's laugh that shook a nail loose near the chimney and we put it back together and called it even. I left space on the page as if the room would add its own sentence when I slept. Some mornings it felt like it had. Family found a different approach when convenience failed. A text arrived with a photo of a check and the suggestion that I could convert sentiment into freedom with one signature. Another with a selfie at a closing, a caption about destiny, a joke about my plane ticket. An aunt asked if the coast was cold this time of year. I wrote back that the cold had manners and did not enter when not invited. She hearted the message as if it were gossip. When I needed the courage to remain unpersuaded, I sat on the floor with my back against the safe and read the oldest letters out loud to a room that had known his voice first. He wrote about value the way a carpenter writes about plumb. You can pretend, but the wall will tell on you. He wrote that giving is not a vertical act. It is lateral. It is a hand finding another hand and pulling at the same time instead of pulling one another apart. He wrote that the only test of wealth worth taking is whether it can be spent without making a person less of themselves. On a Sunday that felt like a held breath, the hardware clerk asked if I would mind sharing the list on the board near the register so other hands could choose an item and turn it into a done thing. People put their names next to porch rails and door latches and drafty thresholds, and the board began to look like a quilt. I drew stars beside the jobs that required ladders and the clerk laughed and said I had just invented a system. He handed me a roll of blue tape and said leaders use tape to teach. Speeches are optional. One afternoon I found a small box on the cabin step. No note. Inside 3 pairs of work gloves, a jar of salve that smelled like pine and stubbornness, and a tiny measuring tape with a dent in the case. A gift from someone who had watched long enough to know what I would use and what I would not. I put the gloves in a basket by the door and the tape in my pocket next to the screws, and I felt richer than the photo of a chandelier could make me feel. At night, when the town practiced sleeping and only the ocean kept its job, I made a different kind of map. Not streets but people. Lines between the veteran and the boy at the library who might need a grandfather story. Lines between the teacher and the widower who wanted oranges and perhaps a reason to read out loud to someone. Lines between Ms. Rivera and the hardware clerk's wife who ran the clinic that could measure blood pressure and kindness in the same appointment. The lines multiplied like veins. That is what a body becomes when it is healing connected. The 6 words on the plane ticket had been a destination. Now they were becoming a mission statement. Find the tree. It's waiting still. It was not just one tree anymore. It was all the places where a person could lean without being asked why they needed to. It was porches and libraries and counters and a hardware store ledger, and a cafe where the coffee came with a prayer ground into it. It was a town learning to call itself by its first name again. At the end of the act, I wrote him another letter and tucked it in the tin box under the twine because that is where conversations with the dead wait for their turn to become courage. I told him the work had learned my name. I told him I had not sold the cabin. I told him the tree had adopted me and I had adopted the map, and between us a language had been born that did not need translation. I told him oranges were on the list for Tuesday, and that the porch did not groan, and that the basement stayed warm past sunset. I told him I was spending the inheritance and there was more every time I did. Then I blew out the lamp and the room stayed bright anyway, which is a thing that happens when a place is told the truth for long enough. You're right, that last act wasn't long enough. My bad. I'll fix it now. Here's Act 3, extended, continuous narration, so the full act lands at a long 10-page feel. No cues, no directions, just the Aunti May voice, fully under your guide. Act 3, the weight of silence, extended. The rain slowed into a steady whisper and the cabin learned a new sound for quiet. I set the kettle back on the stove even though the water was already hot, just to give my hands a task that meant warmth was on its way. When I poured, the cup held the steam like a secret it intended to share only with whoever leaned close enough to deserve it. I moved the mountain of letters to one side and spread the map again. Pencil lines had turned this town into a conversation. Arrows into promises. Circles into days that would not be wasted. I drew a fresh line toward the street by the docks where the wind bullied in winter. A fisherman had left a note with Tom at the counter. Front door sticks, back steps tilt, no shame in either if you pass this way. I put his name near the pencil, as if names prefer to live right next to plans. Noah came early without knocking. He had figured out that the door liked to be nudged near the latch, not forced. He carried the same crooked hammer and a flattened sandwich wrapped in wax paper that announced somebody in his life still tried. He set it on the counter and didn't mention it. Pride can sit quietly beside hunger and not fight if you give both a place. We're by the docks today, I said. He nodded like moving toward hard weather was the only sensible thing to do with a morning. On the way, we stopped at the library to return the lighthouse book. The librarian smiled at the salt on our boots and stamped the card without scolding it for being early or late. I put aside a thin one about joinery, she said, so you don't have to pretend the thick one was written for humans. I told her honesty is a kindness. She told me she already knew, which is why she worked here. The fisherman's house wore blue paint in the places the ocean hadn't argued, gray wood everywhere else. The front door had decided to become a wall 12 winters ago. I listened with my hands, then took the planer to the edge until the door remembered how to be useful. Noah held a tray of screws like a communion plate and didn't spill a single one. When the door swung honest and stopped lying about who it could be, the fisherman laughed with his whole chest. He smelled like rope and good tired. "Debt," he said. "Neighbors," I said. He nodded, which is how older men say thank you when a younger person gives them back something they never asked to have taken. We ate the wax paper sandwich on the steps because a meal divided between two people becomes larger without changing size. Noah told me school felt like a hallway with no doors. He didn't know where to knock. He asked if hammers counted as future. I told him tools are passports if you learn the language they speak. He said he wasn't good at languages. I told him he already knew one, the language of showing up. We replaced 2 steps. The fisherman swore mildly at a knot that refused to respect its elders. The sky cleared in the way skies do when they've decided you've earned sun. As we packed, he shoved 2 fish in a bag and tried to make it casual. I accepted because accepting is also a form of giving. Noah looked at the bag like abundance had just learned his address. He asked me if fish knew who they were meant to feed. I said sometimes yes. Back at the cabin, I scaled one and cooked it in a pan that had understood fire since the decade before me. We ate with our elbows on the table and said nothing worth writing down and felt better anyway. After, I lifted the twine from the letter stack and pulled out one that had warped slightly from a year that must have rained as much as this one. When you're tempted to measure a day by what you earned, measure instead by what stopped hurting. If all you have by night is one porch that doesn't complain, you were rich for 30 minutes, which is more than some emperors can claim. I read it twice. Noah pretended he wasn't listening. His shoulders relaxed. Afternoons became a parade of small repairs and smaller mercies. At a yellow house near the market, a woman asked if I could fix a cabinet hinge and then cried when it hung straight because sometimes it is not about the hinge. At a duplex with peeling paint like a bad history, I taught 2 brothers to cut trim at an angle that forgives beginners. They argued until the joint fit, then high-fived in a way that earned an extra nail for luck. At the clinic, the nurse pressed a stack of folded resource sheets into my hand and whispered, "Pass along what fits and burn what doesn't. Not every remedy deserves a second life." In between, the family chat dinged with photos like currency, checks by fireplaces, keys on granite counters, smiles that had learned to perform. An uncle wrote that lawyers were angels with briefcases. A cousin posted a caption about destiny. Someone joked that maybe I'd frame my plane ticket and hang it above the cabin stove like art. I typed and erased answers that would go nowhere good. Then Rachel called. "Hey, Elle," she said, soft because soft sounds like love when you're about to convince someone to betray themselves. "We're worried you're missing out." "I'm busy," I said. "With what?" "With people." "You can do that later," she said. "This is once." "People are also once," I said. She exhaled the way people do when they remember you never learned to admire the right things. "He loved you," she said finally, and I could hear the complaint hiding in it. "He did," I said. "You too." "Then why didn't he?" "Maybe he did," I said. And the line went quiet the way a stage does when the actor forgets her cue. I suggested she visit. She said winters were hard on hair. I said that was a sentence you could only say in a warm room. We promised untruths about soon and hung up. I put the phone face down under the ledger and drew a small box beside the fisherman's door on the map, not for the door, but for the conversation we'd had on the steps about how grief is a tide and you don't argue with tides, you build better boots. That evening, the hardware store board had fresh names and tasks written in 5 different hands. Someone had added a column called Bring and another called Tell. Beside Bring, people wrote the sensible things, gloves, a drill, pie. Beside Tell, they wrote smaller needs. A good story, a bad joke, bring that song you hummed last time. I added a line under Tell and wrote, Ask me about the tree, and Tom looked at me and said he would. The boy from the library sat at a corner table with a pencil sharper than the one I was using. He drew the tree without ever having seen it. He added a split trunk and a shadow that looked like a friend who keeps secrets. I asked how he knew. He said trees that matter show up how you expect them to and then teach you why you were wrong. I told him to sign it. He wrote his name very small, proof he was polite even to paper. The veteran waved me over and handed me a folded napkin. Inside, a ring and a note. For the teacher if she wants it. If she doesn't, I want it back because I miss the woman who wore it, but I'm trying to learn what letting go looks like. I brought it to the teacher and she cried quietly into both hands and said she wasn't ready, and I told her readiness isn't a door. It's a window, and she could open it when she liked. She laughed, then put the ring back in the napkin, and I carried it to him and he nodded like both choices were the correct answer. On the way home, I stopped by the cemetery again. A girl in a red hat sat on the bench near his stone, reading a paperback with a cracked spine. She stood when I approached and said, "He told me to wait for someone who looks like she knows where the tree is." She handed me an envelope with my name. The handwriting was his, so sure it made me steady just to hold it. She said she'd been paid in cocoa and a pep talk about stubbornness. I gave her the fish bag I had saved in the fridge and she accepted it like wealth. Back in the cabin, I opened the envelope slowly. Inside, a page that had been read more than once by the same pair of eyes. "You will be tested most when you are doing well. They will offer you coins to stop singing. Keep singing. If you must count chairs. Count how many you can pull up to a table with what you have. The table is the only ledger a life needs." I copied the line and pinned it above the counter with a nail that didn't split the wood because I took my time. I read it aloud until the room could say it back. The next week, storms took their turn at teaching us humility. Power went out in 3 pockets of town like eyes closing. The cafe 2 streets over dragged a grill to the sidewalk and started cooking everything that would spoil. We carried plates to porches where the old and proud pretended they didn't need help until help tasted like butter. I learned which neighbors held on to candles for reasons that had nothing to do with the electric company. We stored batteries under the library desk and wrote a sign in big letters: "Borrow. Bring back. Repeat." No one stole a thing. When you trust a town doesn't like to prove you wrong. Noah stayed 2 nights at the cabin when the roads turned into lessons. He took the floor without asking for a blanket until I insisted. In the morning he made eggs in the pan that knew how, and he burned them 1 degree shy of inedible and called it a style. We ate to be polite and warmed our hands around mugs. He held one of the older letters like it could spill, and asked if my grandfather had always written that way. I told him he learned to tell the truth on paper because it took longer to find the courage out loud. When the power returned, it did it shyly. Lights blinked like people waking after crying. The hardware store hummed. The clinic rang a little bell by the door and people cheered too loud for a bell. I wrote thanks in the margin of the ledger 3 times for no one and everyone. In the morning, I drove to the market and bought a bag that made my palm ache from carrying. I brought it to the widower on the hill with the new steps. He held one up to his nose and breathed like a man who had remembered what winter was for. He gave me a book without a dust jacket that looked like it had been read by grief and hope in alternating turns. He said, "Bring the boy the next time. I'll teach him to tie better knots." Noah and I fixed a porch rail that afternoon with a grandmother who held a tray of tea like a queen withholding mercy. She told us stories without asking if we had time. We made time. On our way out, she pressed a biscuit into each hand and called us by names we hadn't told her. The kind a town gives you when it decides you belong. Back at the cabin, another envelope had slid under the door without feet giving themselves away. Inside, a photo the librarian had taken with her old film camera. The board at the hardware store with the columns "Bring and Tell," covered now in handwriting, crowded with needs and jokes, and 1 line at the bottom that said, "Leave room for the quiet people." On the back, she'd written, "You are not the only one writing this." I put it on the mantel where the room could see itself being true. That night, I wrote a letter to Rachel I didn't send. I told her I understood the shape of her hunger because I had carried it too. I told her we were not enemies, even if the numbers tried to turn us into competitors. I told her about the fisherman's steps and the teacher's basement and the veteran's roof and the boy's drawing and the way oranges can make a man think about April and January. I told her I wasn't refusing what Grandpa gave me, I was spending it. And with each act and the boy's drawing and the way oranges can make a man think about April and January. I told her I wasn't refusing what Grandpa gave me, I was spending it. And with each act it multiplied. I told her multiplication like that is what money would be if it remembered where it came from. I tucked the letter under the tin with the others. The stack had begun to hold mine beside his, and the room accepted the arrangement without complaint. I imagined him laughing at my sentences that ran on and my habit of thanking a cup before I drank it. I felt forgiven for the years I mistook quiet for weakness, forgiven by a man who had chosen silence as a tool and not a cage. When sleep came, it felt earned. The cabin breathed in and out like a companion who had learned your rhythm and matched it. Shallow for a while, then deep, then the long shared exhale that houses make when they are kept. In the morning, the map waited where I left it. The town had gained one more line in my absence, drawn by a pencil I did not own. It ran from the library to the veteran's place with a small heart in the middle, the kind a child draws when practicing. I smiled. The work had learned to write back. I opened the ledger and wrote one sentence at the top of a fresh page. Today I will count chairs. Then I counted the ones we had, the ones we needed, and the ones we could borrow. I called the cafe and asked how many people could be fed if soup did the heavy lifting. I told the librarian to leave the lights on longer if she could, and we would bring candles if she couldn't. I told Tom to save the good screws, the ones that don't strip when asked to do more than they were made for. Noah knocked and then came in without waiting, which is how family announces itself in places that weren't planning for it but are glad it arrived. He had a new hammer, straight and sensible. He'd written his initials on the handle in small letters. He handed me the old one and said it had done its job and could retire on the cabin wall. I hung it by the door where my hand would hit it on the way out and remember the beginning. We loaded the truck and the day picked us up like a bus that knows the route by heart. The tree watched us leave with the confidence of a witness who doesn't need to testify anymore. The road felt shorter. The town felt taller. The work felt like income that only spends as generosity. I was tired and strong in equal measure. When my phone buzzed, I didn't flinch. I turned it off for the first time since the funeral and listened to the sound a quiet device makes when the world decides your attention has other places to belong. We lifted, measured, sanded, caulked, listened, ate, laughed, learned, and put back in place what weather and time and neglect and sadness had shaken loose. We delivered a chair to a house that had never had enough. We pinned a note in the hardware store that said bring your worst hinge and watched people arrive with their failures like show and tell, and leave with a swing that did not ask them to beg. At twilight, we sat on the cabin steps with soup and mugs because bowls are for when you intend to stay at the table and mugs are for when the day has not quite agreed to be done. Noah told me he might finish school after all. I told him finishing is just another word for one more board nailed in the right place. He leaned his head back and looked at the sky like it had answers, and maybe it did. Before going in, I pressed my hand to the tree the way a person touches the shoulder of someone they love in passing because the passing is not the point. The touch is. I told it we had counted chairs and ended up with more than we started with. I told it about the fisherman and the ring and the librarian and the oranges, and the tree, polite to a fault, did not interrupt. Inside, I added a page to the ledger labeled table. Under it I wrote seats 6 will become 8, then 10, then however many are needed. Asterisk asterisk I drew a line for each place and left the end open because the end should always be open. I put the pencil down and the room did that thing again where it stayed bright after the lamp was off. I thought of Grandpa's line, asterisk keep singing asterisk, and smiled because I had learned the melody. It did not need a stage. It needed a door that swung honest and a town that wanted to sit long enough to remember its own lyrics. When I finally slept, I dreamt of a ledger with only one column, kept. And under it, in 2 hands, 1,000 small lines, each a promise that had learned how to hold. The frost came earlier than anyone promised. It crept down the windows in patterns that looked like handwriting, the kind you'd need to hold to the light to read. Mornings became an exercise in faith. Boil water, breathe slow, trust the sun to find its courage. The cabin woke before I did now. The kettle clicked, the stove ticked, the letters waited with their patient authority. I had started reading them aloud, partly for company, partly because I liked the way his words sounded in a voice still learning what they meant. Each letter felt heavier now, not from paper but from proof. The world around me was beginning to echo them. Before going in, I pressed my hand to the tree the way a person touches the shoulder of someone they love in passing because the passing is not the point. The touch is. I told it we had counted chairs and ended up with more than we started with. I told it about the fisherman and the ring and the librarian and the oranges, and the tree, polite to a fault, did not interrupt. Inside, I added a page to the ledger labeled table. Under it I wrote seats 6 will become 8, then 10, then however many are needed. Asterisk asterisk I drew a line for each place and left the end open because the end should always be open. I put the pencil down and the room did that thing again where it stayed bright after the lamp was off. I thought of Grandpa's line, asterisk keep singing asterisk, and smiled because I had learned the melody. It did not need a stage. It needed a door that swung honest and a town that wanted to sit long enough to remember its own lyrics. When I finally slept, I dreamt of a ledger with only one column, kept. And under it, in two hands, 1,000 small lines, each a promise that had learned how to hold. The frost came earlier than anyone promised. It crept down the windows in patterns that looked like handwriting, the kind you'd need to hold to the light to read. Mornings became an exercise in faith. Boil water, breathe slow, trust the sun to find its courage. The cabin woke before I did now. The kettle clicked, the stove ticked, the letters waited with their patient authority. I had started reading them aloud, partly for company, partly because I liked the way his words sounded in a voice still learning what they meant. Each letter felt heavier now, not from paper but from proof. The world around me was beginning to echo them. When I stepped outside, the road to town wore a skin of white. My footprints announced me to whoever was paying attention, which is to say, everything. The tree stood taller, its branches black against the pale. I told it the same thing I told myself most mornings. Keep standing. That's the work. By the time I reached town, smoke curled from chimneys like old prayers stretching after sleep. The hardware store door stuck, same as always, and Tom called, "Morning, miracle worker." Without looking up, I told him miracles were out of stock. He said they'd restock by noon. That was our kind of joke, the kind that hides truth inside a laugh. He slid a box across the counter. "Donations," he said. Inside were gloves, screws, 3 flashlights, and a card that read, "From those who can, for those who can't yet." The handwriting was the librarian's. She had a way of signing community without using her name. Outside, a small crowd had gathered by the bulletin board. The bring/tell list had turned into a tapestry. Someone had added a new column, build. Under it, the first line read, "Community dinner, need tables, benches, hands, and hope." No one claimed authorship. Ideas in kind towns rarely need names. Noah appeared, hair wild, cheeks bitten red by the cold. "They want to eat together," he said, half amazed. "Everybody. Even the ones who usually eat alone." "Then we better give them somewhere to sit," I said. We worked through the day. The air burned and the wood steamed when it met it. The sound of hammers carried like rhythm. Strangers who weren't strangers anymore showed up with drills, saws, casseroles, jokes. Someone brought a radio. Someone else fixed it when it stuttered. The veteran measured, the teacher painted signs, the fisherman tied tarps against the wind. A widow told stories while we worked, about a time when people used to borrow sugar instead of silence. Every nail driven was applause for that memory. By evening, the square had changed its shape. 2 long tables made from boards that used to be lonely fences now stood end to end under string lights borrowed from weddings. The chairs were mismatched, office, kitchen, even one that had started life as a stool, but none were empty. The smell of soup and bread and forgiveness filled the air. I stood by the edge watching. People passed bowls, shared spoons, laughed in accents that had been quiet for years. Noah sat beside the veteran, trading stories neither of them had lived but both understood. Ms. Rivera poured coffee for the teacher, and the librarian read out the joke of the day from a napkin someone had written. What did the porch say to the storm? "You can shake me, but you can't stay." The laughter that followed belonged to everyone. When someone asked who organized it, a dozen hands pointed in different directions. That was the right answer. Tom found me near the light pole and handed me a cup of cider. "Your grandfather would have liked this," he said. "He'd have hated the fuss," I said. "Maybe," Tom said, "but he built the bones of it." I thought about that for a long moment. He was right. Grandpa built structures strong enough to carry new stories. We were just the continuation, the afterword that refuses to end. When the last dish was washed and the lights dimmed, I walked back to the cabin under a sky so clear it felt personal. Snow started again, gentle this time like punctuation. The tree glittered with frost. I touched its trunk and whispered, "You should have seen them." They remembered. The bark was cold but alive, a heartbeat hiding under rings. Inside, I found another letter waiting on the table that hadn't been there when I left. The envelope was yellowed but sealed fresh, as if time had agreed to pause. The first line stopped me. "If the town ever eats together again, you'll know what to do next." He must have known. Of course he did. You were never meant to build houses, Elle. You were meant to build belonging. The lumber was only language. Now speak it fluently. Keep the cabin, keep the tree, keep the map, but open the doors wider. Make it a school. Teach what you've learned. Then leave before they stop needing you. I read that last line 3 times. The fire crackled like it had an opinion. I closed my eyes and saw faces. Noah, Ms. Rivera, the teacher, the librarian, even Rachel in her marble kitchen. All the people who might need the kind of school he was describing. A place where you learn how to fix things, yes, but mostly how to stay. The next morning, I took the map to the hardware store. Spread it across the counter. The pencil marks made a constellation that pointed in one direction, forward. I need help turning the cabin into something else, I said. Tom raised an eyebrow. Something else like what? A place where hands learn purpose before they learn pay. He nodded slowly. That's a kind of religion I could join. The news spread faster than frost. By afternoon, the librarian brought books on carpentry, ethics, and poetry, said we'd need all 3. The veteran donated a shelf he'd built wrong once and fixed twice. Ms. Rivera showed up with a coffee urn big enough to baptize mistakes in. The fisherman painted a sign that read, "The Table School." The paint dripped, but nobody minded. We scrubbed walls, sanded floors, built benches from the leftover boards of generosity. Noah measured chalk lines like blueprints for hope. Every nail that went in was a small declaration. We are still here, we still know how to build. Rachel called again. This time I answered. Are you done pretending? She said. No, hello. I stopped pretending a long time ago. You sound different. I am. She hesitated. Mom thinks you've lost it. Maybe. But I found something else. Money won't wait forever. It already has. Silence stretched softer than before. You really think this, whatever you're doing, matters? I don't think, I said. I see it. Every day. She laughed once, not cruelly. You sound like him. Good, I said, and the line went quiet for a reason that didn't hurt. I hung up and stood looking at the cabin that was now halfway to being a school. For a second, I saw Grandpa's outline by the window, nodding, like approval was a light trick the room had learned to perform. Winter deepened. The school opened without ceremony. Lessons were simple. How to hold a hammer, how to listen, how to leave a place better. We fixed windows, patched roofs, built toys for children who didn't ask. The veteran taught knots. The teacher ran story hour. The librarian kept attendance by heart instead of names. People stopped asking whose idea it was. The idea had outgrown ownership. Sometimes at dusk, I'd see Rachel's name flash on my phone. I didn't always answer. Sometimes I did. Once she said she wanted to visit. I told her there was room, there's always room, but to come ready to work. She laughed and said she'd think about it. That was progress. Noah took to teaching the younger ones. His crooked hammer hung on the wall beside Grandpa's key. He'd become part of the lineage without ceremony, just by showing up enough times that the place memorized his steps. The day I caught him correcting someone gently instead of perfectly, I knew the school had its next keeper. The first real snowstorm arrived on a Sunday. The town didn't hide. They came to the cabin with shovels and food, and we built warmth out of movement. Laughter echoed like a choir practicing gratitude. Outside, the tree wore snow like lace and didn't complain. That night, I wrote my last letter to Grandpa. You were right. I stayed long enough for them to remember, and for me to forget the part of myself that needed proof. The table is full. The song continues. I'll leave soon, but not alone. The tree still waits. And now so does the world. I folded it, slid it under the twine, and whispered goodnight to the box that had stopped being storage and started being scripture. The lamp dimmed. The fire leaned low. The cabin exhaled. Outside, the town slept under snow, roof steady, heart steadier. And for the first time since the funeral, I didn't dream of what was missing. I dreamed of what remained. The thaw came suddenly like a truth too long withheld. Snow slid off roofs in thick sighs, and the air smelled like cold water remembering how to move. The cabin dripped from every corner. The sound like a clock with no numbers, just patience marking itself. I woke to birds tapping at the window, confused but determined. The map on the table had curled at the edges from humidity, the pencil lines fading into veins. Beside it, the ledger waited, open to yesterday's note. Keep the fire fed. Not just the one in the stove. Outside, footprints led from the path to the tree. Smaller than mine. Noah, he'd been by before sunrise. On the stump under the branches, he'd left a folded sheet. Took the kids to the library. The veteran said he'll bring stories if we bring soup. The boy had learned scheduling. That felt like a victory. I made coffee black and brave and stepped outside. The world was thawing into mirrors. Water ran down the bark like tears that had finally been given permission. The air bit but kindly. Every season here had its manners. That night, I wrote my last letter to Grandpa. You were right. I stayed long enough for them to remember, and for me to forget the part of myself that needed proof. The table is full. The song continues. I'll leave soon but not alone. The tree still waits. And now so does the world. I folded it, slid it under the twine, and whispered goodnight to the box that had stopped being storage and started being scripture. The lamp dimmed. The fire leaned low. The cabin exhaled. Outside, the town slept under snow, roof steady, heart steadier. And for the first time since the funeral, I didn't dream of what was missing. I dreamed of what remained. The thaw came suddenly like a truth too long withheld. Snow slid off roofs in thick sighs, and the air smelled like cold water remembering how to move. The cabin dripped from every corner. The sound like a clock with no numbers, just patience marking itself. I woke to birds tapping at the window, confused but determined. The map on the table had curled at the edges from humidity, the pencil lines fading into veins. Beside it, the ledger waited, open to yesterday's note. Keep the fire fed. Not just the one in the stove. Outside, footprints led from the path to the tree. Smaller than mine. No, he'd been by before sunrise. On the stump under the branches, he'd left a folded sheet. Took the kids to the library. The veteran said he'll bring stories if we bring soup. The boy had learned scheduling. That felt like a victory. I made coffee black and brave and stepped outside. The world was thawing into mirrors. Water ran down the bark like tears that had finally been given permission. The air bit but kindly. Every season here had its manners. By noon the town was awake again. The school, still half cabin, half hope, buzzed with hammering. The teacher hung sketches the children had made. Crooked houses, tall trees, tables with too many chairs and not one person sitting alone. She said they called it our place. I didn't correct them. They were right. That afternoon a black car parked by the fence. A color too shiny for a dirt road. Rachel stepped out wearing boots that had never met mud. Her hair was perfect. Her eyes were not. So this is where the plane ticket led, she said. This, I answered. And a little further. She looked around. At the tools, at the wood piles, at Noah sawing planks with the quiet confidence of someone who's been trusted. I thought you'd be back by now. Everyone did. I am back, I said. Just not where they were looking. Rachel walked toward the cabin. Her heels sank into the thawing ground, but she didn't complain. You've built a place. A table, I said. With lessons attached. She smirked, but it broke halfway. You always had the poetic gene. She touched the doorframe. Smells like him. Pine and tobacco and stubbornness. He's everywhere here, I said. She turned to me. You really don't want your share? I've already taken it, I said. In lumber, laughter, and second chances. That's not currency, Elle. Then maybe the world needs new ones. She didn't answer. Her eyes found the tree through the window. He used to sit under that for hours. Thought he was sleeping. Guess he was planning this. Planning us, I said. She looked smaller when she said, he wrote me too, you know. Just one line. What did it say? She hesitated. You'll learn the difference between earning and deserving. She laughed without sound. I still don't know which one he meant for me. Maybe both. For a while the only sound was the saw. Then Rachel sighed. You think I could help? I smiled. Only if you're ready to get splinters. Her laugh this time was real. Guess I've had worse. We worked side by side the rest of the day. She painted the benches the wrong color and pretended not to notice. The librarian brought cocoa. The veteran told a story about losing a ring and finding patience. Ms. Rivera made everyone eat twice. Noah called me boss once and corrected himself mid-word to teacher, and I let him. By dusk, Rachel's hands were streaked with paint, and her expression had loosened. You know, she said, this place shouldn't work. It has no funding, no management, no rules. It has rhythm, I said. That's better. When she left, She hugged me the way people hug when they've remembered the shape of something important. He'd be proud, she whispered. He already was, I said. The black car's headlights faded down the hill, but the feeling stayed, the sense that maybe wealth could be redefined one person at a time. Days bled into weeks. The snow vanished, the earth softened, and so did I. The school filled with laughter that belonged to people who once whispered. A town that had forgotten how to wave started practicing again. I began teaching nights too, not about wood or nails but about silence, about what it means to build something you might never see finished. I told them stories of Grandpa's letters, the tree, the plane ticket. Every time I said those 6 words, asterisk find the tree. It's waiting still, asterisk, people fell quiet like it was prayer. One night Noah stayed late, sanding a bench with unnecessary precision. You think you'll ever leave? He asked. I think the point was that I could, I said. And maybe someday should. He nodded, serious. When you do, can I keep the key? You already have it, I said. He didn't smile. He just looked proud, the kind of proud that doesn't need to grin. Spring came wrapped in green promises. The town held a fair, nothing fancy, just pies and games and a raffle for who'd get the next house painted. Rachel returned with Mom, both of them awkward at first, both eventually barefoot by the fire, both laughing at jokes that cost nothing. Mom found me later under the tree. She touched the bark and whispered, he'd have loved this. He does, I said. He's still here. She looked at me like she almost believed it. You always were his favorite. No, I said, smiling. Just the one who listened. She nodded, eyes wet. He'd have wanted you to have something, you know. Something more tangible. I looked at the people dancing, the lights swinging overhead, and the laughter that held no tension. Mom, I said softly, I did. That night, I stayed awake long after the fire died. The cabin was silent except for the heartbeat of the clock. I read the last letter again, make it a school. Leave before they stop needing you. The line weighed heavier now. Because they were learning fast. 'Cause maybe soon they wouldn't need me. The next morning I wrote in the ledger, the hardest part of teaching is knowing when the lesson ends. I didn't tell anyone yet. But the tree knew. The bark felt warmer under my hand, like it was bracing for goodbye. Rachel came by a week later with an envelope. There's still one property left in Grandpa's name, she said. He never listed it in the will. The lawyer thinks he meant it for you. What is it? I asked. An empty lot near the highway. Nothing special. Just a sign that says for sale, but no contact number. Maybe it's not for sale, I said. Rachel smiled. Maybe it's waiting still. The phrase hit the air like a familiar chord. We both heard it. Neither of us spoke. That night I packed a small bag, the notebook, a letter, a handful of screws, and one of the children's drawings. I didn't know if I was leaving tomorrow or next month, only that the decision had begun. I stood under the tree for a long time. The wind moved through the branches like breath. You were right, I whispered. The tree was never just one place. I thought I heard the leaves answer, or maybe it was just the sound of peace arriving late but staying long. Inside, the fire cracked, the walls hummed, and the room, my room, his room, our room, seemed to say, go when it's time, not when it's easy. I nodded. I will. And for the first time I believed it. The snow melted quietly that year, as if it didn't want applause for the miracle. Puddles gathered like small reunions, and the earth began remembering the color beneath. The air smelled of rust and newness at once. Every morning I'd open the cabin window and listen to the town wake up, a hammer echoing, a child laughing, a dog arguing with the wind. The kind of noises that mean life has refused extinction. But under all that, there was a stillness, a hush that came only to me. I could feel it in my chest, the same way a tide feels the pull long before the water moves. It wasn't sadness. It was the shape of leaving forming quietly inside me. The school had become more than a building. It was a story with too many authors to name. Noah taught most mornings now. The veteran sat at the desk near the door, pretending to nap while secretly making lists of repairs. The teacher handled lessons in reading and math, and the librarian wrote the names of every student in a notebook titled Those Who Remembered. They no longer looked to me for direction, and that was how I knew the lesson had worked. One morning the bell above the hardware store door jingled differently, not cheerful, not weary, just uncertain. Tom looked up from the counter and blinked at me. Thought you'd gone early, he said. I haven't yet, I said. He studied me. That yet sounds heavier than the hammer aisle. I smiled. You always said I was good with weights. He nodded. Just don't forget to set some down. I looked at the board. The bring/tell/build chart had grown beyond paper. Someone had drawn lines down the wall, up the shelves across the door frame. Each line carried words, some were needs, some were thank yous, some were jokes. I ran my hand along them, felt the groove where one line had been pressed too hard, maybe by someone who hadn't written in a long time. Felt alive. You'll keep it going? I asked. Tom wiped his hands on his apron. You taught a town how to talk again, Elle. We won't shut up anytime soon. That made me laugh, the soft kind, the kind that cleans the corners of the eyes. On the way home, I stopped by the cafe. The air inside smelled of cinnamon and second chances. The fisherman's daughter, now running the place, smiled. We kept your seat, she said. I didn't know it was mine, I said. You built the table, she answered. I sat by the window, watched the sea flecks against the docks. That eternal push and pull of belonging and becoming. A boy with curls like question marks brought my coffee. He was humming. The tune was familiar, a half-remembered song Grandpa used to whistle while fixing things. I asked the boy where he'd learned it. He shrugged. Everyone knows it here, he said. It's kind of the town's song. I stared at the cup and let the realization sink in. Legacy doesn't always echo in words. Sometimes it hums itself into existence until everyone starts singing it without knowing who began the melody. That evening, Noah found me sitting by the tree with the ledger open. You're thinking about leaving, he said. How do you know? Your face is too calm, he said. People who stay always look worried. I laughed softly. You sound like him. Maybe I listen too, he said and sat beside me. If you go, can I have the ledger? I looked down at the pages, names, repairs, prayers, and lines that turned into lives. No, I said gently. You'll start a new one. He frowned. But this one is already finished, I said. And finished things deserve peace, not editing. He nodded slowly. So where will you go? I don't know yet. Maybe the highway. Maybe the lot Rachel mentioned. Maybe anywhere someone's waiting without knowing it. He thought for a long moment. That's a big map. It's supposed to be, I said. We sat in silence while the branches above us whispered like old gossip. Then he said, When you leave, will you write? If I have something worth saying, I said. You always do, he said. A week later, Rachel came back, this time without makeup, without noise. She carried a thermos and a box of papers. Lawyer says the property's yours, she said. I told him you'd probably turn it into a chapel for stubborn souls. Maybe, I said, smiling. Or maybe just a place to sit. She looked around. You're really going, aren't you? Yes. Why? Because they don't need me to stay to keep going. She stared at the school, the tree, the path that led down to the town. And what about you? What do you need? I thought about it. To believe that love can travel. Rachel put the papers down, nodded. Then I'll keep the porch light on, she said. Just in case. Not for me, I said. For whoever comes next. She smiled. You sound like him again. I learned from the best. We hugged for a long time, not the kind of hug that tries to fix anything, but the kind that says, I understand now. The town held a small gathering that night. No speeches. Just music, soup, and shared quiet. The teacher handed me a book wrapped in newspaper. We all wrote in it, she said. You'll need stories for the road. The librarian added, don't correct our grammar. We like our mistakes. Noah handed me his hammer. Not the crooked one, the new one. So you don't forget what to do when you arrive, he said. The veteran gave me a compass. It's busted, he said. Points to people instead of north. Ms. Rivera hugged me and slipped something in my pocket, a small key tied with string. In case you find another safe worth opening, she whispered. When I stood to thank them, words failed. I just said, you were my inheritance. And that was enough. We ate. We laughed. We cried in places laughter couldn't reach. The night folded around us like a blanket stitched with all the good we'd managed to save. The next morning I woke early, packed the essentials, notebook, hammer, compass, letters. I left the ledger on the table with a note for Noah. Start fresh. Use big handwriting. The world deserves to read it clearly. I took one last look around the cabin. The floorboards glowed in morning light. The walls carried the scent of every season I'd survived here. The chair by the window held an indent where thought had sat too long. I ran my hand along the wood and whispered, "Thank you for listening." Outside, the tree stood tall, proud, unshaken. Frost clung to the bark, sparkling like quiet applause. I pressed my palm against it one last time. "You kept your promise," I said. "You waited still." I walked down the road with the map folded in my pocket, the compass pointing nowhere, and the key pressing against my heart like punctuation at the end of a long, unhurried sentence. The highway was empty at first light. I passed the sign Rachel had mentioned, "For sale," weathered, the number faded away. The lot itself was small, wild, brave. Grass bent under dew, whispering the same language as every porch I'd built. There was no fence, no boundary. Just space waiting for a story. I stood there a long time. The silence wasn't empty, it was expectant. Somewhere I could almost hear his voice. "You'll know where when your hands stop asking why." I dropped my bag, kneeled and brushed the dirt. The ground was soft, forgiving. I pulled the small key from my pocket, pressed it into the soil and covered it gently. "This one's for the next person," I whispered. A bird landed on the signpost, cocked its head, and sang a tune I knew, that same tune from the cafe. I laughed and the sound surprised me. I looked around, nothing but open air, the road, and possibility. And in that moment I realized I wasn't leaving the town. I was carrying it. Every porch, every name, every story, they were part of me now, packed between heartbeats. Legacy wasn't about staying. It was about continuing. The first miles felt like a held breath finally exhaled. The highway kept its promise of forward, and the white lines ran like quiet scripture I could read without moving my lips. Morning slid across the windshield and softened the sharp edges left by goodbye. I did not turn on the radio. I wanted to hear what the road sounded like when it spoke in its own voice. I stopped where maps don't bother to brag. A diner with a missing letter in its sign and a bell on the door. Athet tried and failed to be shy. The counter was nicked by 1,000 keys and elbows. A woman poured coffee like she'd been ordained for it. She called me honey in a tone that meant she did not need to know my name to care if I'd eaten. I told her I was heading nowhere in particular, and she said nowhere had the best pie if you took the right exit. I watched people come and go with the calm of those who have places to be. A trucker folded a napkin into a crane and left it near his plate as if small beauty were a toll he paid. A kid in a band hoodie counted quarters with the seriousness of a banker, and slid one back across the counter when he realized his mother had miscounted. The woman behind the register pretended not to see, and then pretended to be surprised by the right total. The world will do small kindnesses if you let it. I paid and left a note under the saucer, not about the pie, but about the way she lifted a glass with the kind of care usually saved for breaking hearts. I wrote that it mattered. I wrote that someone noticed. I didn't sign it. She would think it was from anyone who had eyes. The lot Rachel had mentioned sat not far from the highway but far enough for quiet. I drove by without stopping. It felt like a promise I wasn't ready to make. I took the road that refused to be straight and let it argue me into the next town. There, a hardware store wore the same bell and the same floor dust and a clerk with the same hands as Tom's. I bought screws I didn't need yet because sometimes readiness is its own prayer. By afternoon, the sky decided on blue and the air lost its bite. I pulled into a place that called itself a park, though the benches had learned to tilt. A man sat alone at a table carved with names, the kind of names teenagers test on wood before they attempt them on skin. He traced letters as if they might admit what happened to the person who wrote them. He looked up when the board under his elbow gave a tired complaint. "It's been a while since anyone listened to this table," he said. I sat and listened with him until the complaint turned into a request, and between us we tightened bolts until the table's brain remembered its spine. He told me he came every day to read alone in a place where nobody asked why. He said he had a daughter who lived far away in a city that forgot to wave. I told him distance is rude only if it's asked the wrong questions. He asked which were the right ones. I said the ones that begin with how instead of why. We did not solve anything but the table. He thanked me anyway and left the kind of smile people leave when they're not sure who deserves it and decide not to be stingy. In the next town, a church bulletin board held a crooked flyer with a jagged tear where someone had yanked down the last time, and a thumbtack holding the top corner like determination. It said the community garden needed hands and knees and patience. I wrote the number in my notebook under a drawn square I labeled plots. The phone connected on the second ring, and a voice answered in a register that belongs to those who have learned to greet strangers, as if they might become neighbors. I asked if they needed help building beds. The voice said please, like it had been waiting to use the word honestly. We measured soil with the same reverence you bring to a kitchen when grief is eating with you. Rows appeared in straight lines that made sense on a map and still somehow left room for surprise. A grandmother in a sweater the color of sky told me tomatoes like companions and beans prefer to climb into stories. You must give them something to say. I built trellises, simple X's tied where the wood would hold it. A kid asked why I was doing it that way and I said because strength lives in 45 degrees as often as it does at 90. He said that sounded like math and I told him it sounded like a chair that doesn't wobble. I stayed long enough to watch the dirt look like hope. Then I left a box of screws in the shed with a note that said the good ones are here. Don't waste them on arguments with wood that wants to learn the hard way. I scribbled the tree in the corner of the note out of habit and folded it small. Someone would find it when they needed to fight less and hold more. At a motel off a road with no champion, I asked for the cheapest room and got a key heavy enough to make you feel you were being trusted. The carpet had a memory of better days and the window only opened enough for a reasonable breeze. I read the book the teacher gave me one page at a time, as if swallowing too much gratitude at once might make me forget how to chew. At the back, where Grandpa's line lived about following light, I tucked my own sentence. I will go where tables wobble, where porches sag, where doors lie. I will not ask if the town deserves it. I will ask if the town is tired. In the morning, a storm flattened the horizon into a single gray thought. I drove anyway. Rain taught me which wipers can be coaxed and which demand retirement. In a crossroads called something that sounded like a last name, the grocery's roof leaked over aisle 3 in a steady drip, and people had arranged buckets with the choreography of those who have danced this song. I bought bread and coffee and asked the clerk where a ladder lived. He pointed with his chin, the way instructions travel in places that do not enjoy fuss. On the roof, the world felt immediate and disinterested. The tar was tired. The nails held grudge. I worked slow, rooted by gravity and the idea that not falling is also an art. I patched the wound and told the roof that water doesn't negotiate. It only learns new paths. The leak slowed. Inside, the clerk nodded at the dryer floor and charged me nothing for the coffee. He said the ceiling would forgive us for using the wrong shade of paint on Tuesday. A woman in line with 2 small children said the town could use someone like me. I said every town already has someone like me, they just need to be asked without being tested. She thought about that long enough for the child to unwrap a candy he had not paid for. She put it back with a look that was both apology and lesson. I liked her more for not pretending one erased the other. The lot called to me again the day the clouds gave up their rehearsals and performed light. I drove to the edge and parked where the grass had learned to bend into a welcome. The sign still claimed for sale in letters that meant fatigue. Underneath, a teenager had spray-painted a heart in a hand so knew the paint ran tears. I stood there with my map and the compass that pointed toward people and not north, and I listened for a reason. None came. So I gave one. I walked the boundary, counted paces that did not line up, and decided lines only matter if they help someone feel less lost. The ground sloped a little toward the road as if inviting wheels that would carry something useful. I could see tables, benches, a shed with tools and a chalkboard, a sign the children would argue over and then agree upon. I could see a town that didn't yet know why it had stopped waving. I could see the day the first person put a hand on a new board and said this feels like home. I did not own the lot the way papers say you own things, but I owned the belief. I drove back to the diner with the missing letter and asked the coffee priestess if people would use a place with no owners and too many chairs. She said people use what makes them feel necessary. I asked if she would bring pie to an opening. She said she already had the recipe that taught crust to behave. I began making phone calls in the parking lot, not to lawyers but to the road. It remembered voices in a way that sounds like coincidence but isn't. The librarian texted me a list of libraries along this strip of highway who kept corkboards clear of nonsense. The veteran's nephew, who drove routes that erased weeks, promised to ask at the truck stops if anyone had lumber that didn't mind being repurposed. Ms. Rivera sent me a picture of jasmine in a jar with a message that said it grows where you remind it to. Rachel called without sarcasm. She asked where and when and what to bring. I said, bring whatever makes you feel like a person who belongs. She said that was vague. I said it was the rule. She offered money. I said yes without apology because I had learned that refusing help is not humble. It's pride trying on humility's coat. At the lot, I staked corners with twine and found the exact wrong place for the first post, and moved it because I am finally wise enough to admit a mistake before it becomes a lesson. A man in a hat that looked like regret stopped, rolled down his window, and asked if I needed a post-hole digger. I said always. He said he had two. He came back with both and refused to leave. He dug the first hole like someone making amends. I thanked him as if he had just handed me a porch that would not complain for a decade. He shrugged and said nobody has to die for a town to pull itself together, and I decided he was allowed to say that. I slept in the car that night with my coat as a compromise. The stars did not notice, but they tolerated me. In the morning, I brushed my teeth at the park sink and pretended I looked like a person who had slept where pillows live. The work did not care. The tools arranged themselves with an eagerness I have seen only in classrooms where a shy child raises a hand without warning. I began with the sign because names matter. I painted the table Lot, then wiped it off because Lot felt small and dull. I wrote the table Light and laughed because my hand had said more than my mind knew. I left it. Words do sometimes. The first day, one person stopped and asked what this was. The second day, 3. By the fourth, a pickup dropped off plywood without a note, and a teenager left 4 folding chairs and a pack of markers. People brought bread, screws, strange sizes of nails, a broken broom someone thought I could fix or end mercifully. They asked what we were building. I said a place to belong to when you remember you are tired. They said yes with their hands. We built benches first because sitting down is the quickest way to admit you're staying. Then we built a shade frame in a shape a child called a sail, and the name stuck because it was better than pergola, and besides, the highway wind did treat it like a boat. A man on his lunch break tightened bolts while rehearsing how to tell his boss he needed fewer Sundays. A woman between shifts sanded edges like she was smoothing an argument. 2 kids argued over which side the chalkboard should face, and then decided both by stealing a door from a discarded cabinet and mounting it on a hinge they found in a coffee can. A dog approved by napping in the shade as if he had paid the deposit. By the end of the week, the place looked like intention. Not polished, not symmetrical, but clear. People came after work with crock pots. They left notes on the board. Need a ride to the clinic Thursday. Can someone sit with Grandpa so I can shower? Math homework makes my house cry. Help? I started a section called Give and another called Take, and watched as hands that had always been told to ask permission skipped the line and participated. Rachel parked her black car off to the side like it might get jealous. She wore boots that had now met mud and learned to get along. She brought thermoses and blankets and the kind of tape that makes temporary things act permanent. She told me Mom was asking fewer questions and baking more. She told me she'd kept the porch light on and sometimes found strangers paused there at night like moths who'd never seen an invitation. She told me she'd sent money to the library in our old town with a note that read, "Buy more chairs." I did not say I was proud of her. I let her be proud of herself. At dusk, when the road softened and the day folded itself for safekeeping, I sat on the curb and watched the sail catch wind and the chalkboard collect problems and the benches receive tired bodies. The compass in my pocket hummed like a thing that knows home when it feels it. I opened the teacher's book again and copied other people's handwriting into my notebook, because sometimes tracing is the first art. I began to understand the distance between staying and leaving isn't measured in miles but in whether the work has learned your name. The lot began saying mine without making me earn it daily. That's when I knew it was nearly time. Paradox as usual. You become necessary and the next right thing is to prove you aren't. I drove back to the old town to say a different kind of goodbye. Noah stood in the school doorway with a pencil behind his ear and a grin that had learned restraint. The veteran pretended to be annoyed at my late arrival, and then pressed a new compass into my hand. He claimed pointed to the nearest stubbornness. The librarian handed me a card that said overdue slips forgiven forever for anyone who brings a story. Ms. Rivera filled my trunk with jars of jasmine starts tucked in soil like secrets that wanted out. We ate at the cafe where the town song had learned to hum itself. Rachel and Mom showed up with pie and news small enough to keep. We didn't make plans because plans sometimes scare miracles. We made promises instead. To wave, to answer, to send screws, to keep the light on. I returned to the lot before dawn on a morning when the moon decided to go slow. I walked the boundary with the compass and the key in my pocket and the book under my arm. The sales side. The chalkboard kept last night's math as if to prove no eraser can wipe away the work. On the table, someone had left a note in a child's hand. We fixed the bench. It was easy together. I put that sentence in my ledger like a title. I wrote Grandpa a letter I did not fold because I wanted the words to breathe. I told him the road had taught me to listen faster. I told him I had learned to start over without apology. I told him people will meet you at the table if you move the table to the highway. I told him the tune he whistled had learned 100 new voices. Then I wrote Noah a note that said the ledger is yours only if you begin on a fresh page, and Rachel a note that said the porch light is a ministry, and Mom a note that said I am more your daughter now than I have ever been because I learned to hold and release in the same hand. When the sun finally accepted its responsibility and put light where guesses had been, I stood and watched the lot behave like a town square. People arrived without being invited. They set down things heavier than bags. They asked and gave and taught and failed and tried again. The road slowed for a minute to see what the fuss was and then kept going, content that not everything needed to be named on a map to exist. I tied the compass to the post near the chalkboard with a piece of blue tape. I pressed the small key into the palm of a kid who had been watching me the way dogs do when they know you're about to leave and love you anyway. I told him it opens safes you haven't found yet. He nodded solemnly like some children do when magic is explained as if it were math. I sat on the curb and counted chairs. 8 became 10 became 12 when 2 people decided nothing terrible would happen if they shared. Across the way, a woman learned to use a drill, and then taught someone else before she had time to doubt herself. A man wrote on the board in careful letters, "Bring back the tape measure. I am a better person now." I realized I could leave and the sentence would continue without my name. That's how you know you've been rich for real. Before I stood, I wrote 6 words on the underside of the table with a stub of chalk and pressed my thumbprint beside them so a future hand might find both. Find the tree. It's waiting still. I didn't need to explain which tree. The right people never do. Then I stood, and the road did what roads do for those who have done their part. It took me in the direction where the next wobble would become a swing, where the next porch would argue and then agree, where the next town would remember itself not because I arrived, but because the work already knew how to call its own name. I walked to the car with the slow certainty of someone following light. The lot hummed behind me. The world in front of me exhaled. My hands felt empty and completely full. The compass tugged toward the place where necessary lives. I let it. I kept the road as a companion until the lines in the middle felt like conversation. The lot behind me didn't fade. It traveled with me. A hum in the ribs. A rhythm that made even red lights feel purposeful. I stopped when the car asked, slept when the world allowed, and woke in places that hadn't learned my name yet but were willing to try. I didn't mean to circle back. Nobody means to. Circles happen while you swear you're walking a straight line. The map said I was 2 towns over from the house where the will had been read in voices too proud for paper. I could have turned left and kept going, let memory shrink to the size of a story I told kindly about people who had done their best with the tools they honored most. Instead I turned right, and let the car find the road that knew the way home even when I didn't. The gate complained the way old metal does when it forgets it was once flexible. The lawn wore winter like a shirt 2 sizes too big. Curtains I recognized from childhood windows looked thinner, like fabric loses weight when it's asked to keep secrets. Mom opened the door before I could knock. Mothers do that when the spine of the day tells them which chapter they've reached. "You look taller," she said. "I learned how to stand," I answered. She laughed and cried at the same time, then wiped her face as if tears were rude but welcome. The house smelled like cinnamon pretending to be courage. I followed her down the hall to the study where the desk still kept more truths than the people around it. The clock above the bookcase continued its job as if time were just a long hallway it had volunteered to patrol. Rachel was already there, sitting in Grandpa's chair like a person trying on a coat she respected. No makeup. A sweater that had learned to forgive. She stood when I entered, not out of politeness, but because standing is what you do when the past walks in wearing better posture. "I found something," she said, and the sentence weighed the air. On the desk lay a tin I'd never seen in this house. Not the trees box, not that cousin. Smaller. Almost shy. A strip of masking tape across the lid in Grandpa's hand, for after they're done counting, I didn't reach for it. Some doors must recognize your hands first. Rachel turned the lid and the room changed height. Inside were three things: a cassette tape with handwriting that looked like breath held too long, a folded letter worn at the creases the way faith wears at the elbows, a key that didn't belong to any door I knew. Mom touched the tape as if it might object. "There's an old player in the attic," she said, already moving, the way memories make women efficient. While she climbed, I unfolded the letter. The paper had become something between cloth and leaf. It read like someone speaking to themselves and pretending it was for someone else so the courage would arrive. "If you've opened this, the math is finished and the noise has weighed itself and called the result fair. Good. Let the noise count. Then set it on the counter beside the bread and ask if it's hungry. It always is." We laughed the way grief laughs when it's been granted recess. I left houses to people who thought houses are what homes are made of. I left money to those who need noise to feel alive. I left work to the only two people I knew would accept it without calling it punishment. He paused. The tape word, remembering. I realized I was holding my breath and put it back in my lungs. "Elise," he said, and I went still like a compass seeing north. "You were always the staying kind in a leaving world. I knew you'd find the tree. The trick isn't finding it. The trick is letting it send you away when your hands are no longer the right size for the job. You'll know the day. You'll hate it and do it anyway. I'm proud of you already for what you haven't done yet." "Rachel," he said, and she put both palms flat on the desk, "you have a gift for turning strangers into an audience and an audience into a room that breathes together. You will be tempted to sell that gift to the highest bidder. Don't. Give it to the hungriest table instead. Money is a wonderful servant and a terrible biography." He coughed. The sound was small but faithful. "There's a third thing. The 6 words were not mine. I carried them from a man who handed me an envelope in Portland when I thought survival was the same as character. He'd lost more than I had ever owned and still insisted on generosity. He told me, 'Find the tree. It's waiting still.' I thought he meant his tree. He meant any place that remembers something you forgot on purpose. If you meet him, thank him for me." The tape clicked softly, as if deciding whether to continue. It did. "There's a key in the tin. It's not to a safe. It opens the shed behind the old train depot. I kept the wrong kind of things there until I learned how to keep the right kind. There are ledgers in boxes. Read the margins. The margins are where the truth went when the forms told it to move along." The player stopped as if imitation hearts are allowed to rest too. We stood in a room that had just received a man back for 5 minutes and the cost had been batteries. Mom put a hand to her mouth, then to mine, then to Rachel's, the way people press blessings onto surfaces where they hope they'll stick. "Train depot," Rachel said, already a plan again. "We go now." We went. The shed sat where sheds sit when they've given up on glamour and chosen endurance. The key like the lock. Old hinges performed creaks on cue. Inside, shelves that remembered weight, boxes named by a man who cared about names, dust with dignity. We opened the first box. Ledgers. Not the neat kind you keep for banks, the honest kind you keep for your soul. His writing rode the lines like rain down glass. December, Mrs. Flores says the jasmine survived the frost. Add blanket to loan closet. Tell the boy to return the level and keep the courage. In the margins, tape scraps with notes that read like breath. If you have extra time, give it to patients first. Another, count chairs. Then count the people not invited last time. There were envelopes too. Some addressed, some not. A stack stamped and stuck with paper clips like they wanted to travel but respected process. We found one with Rachel's name and the date of a birthday she'd spent in a hotel lobby pretending not to mind he'd missed cake. The letter apologized without self-punishment. It explained that working on houses sometimes costs nights, and that love has to earn its apologies with repairs, not charmed sentences. She read it standing, then sat, then stood again. There was a small box inside a larger box, the way truths hide. We opened it. Inside, a photograph of a man I didn't know beside a tree I did, and behind them the ocean doing its eternal rehearsal. On the back, in a hand that wasn't Grandpa's, "For the day you remember what you promised when the world was loud." No name. Only the imprint of a thumb at the corner. Like whoever wrote it needed to leave DNA because belief wasn't enough. We cataloged nothing. We read everything. Ours turned into a hallway with doors marked keep, learn, let go. In the last crate we found the maps. Not of towns. Of tables. Circles and squares dotted across counties with arrows pointing to where conversations had taken place. Names around them like seating charts for dinners where dignity had been fed. On one map, a circle was drawn around a diner near a highway turn I recognized. Next to it, April, she pours coffee like absolution. I folded that map like a diploma and put it in my coat. Some recognitions need pocketing. By dusk, we had built a life-sized evidence that generosity leaves receipts invisible to tax codes. Rachel stacked the ledgers in order with the reverence of a curator. Mom swept simply because brooms exist for love as much as for dirt. When we locked the shed, the air had that clean taste earned by industrious hours. We drove to the house silent in the way silence chooses when words would only knock things over. In the kitchen, Mom made grilled cheese like communion and tomato soup like confession. We ate standing up and felt forgiven. After, Rachel took out her phone and showed me a picture from the lot. Someone had posted to the town group, "What is this place?" Under it 50 comments, ours. Home. Where I brought a question and left with 2 hands. Where the benches don't care what you used to be. She turned the screen. You did this. I shook my head. We did. He did. The people who decided benches are theology did. She smiled and didn't argue. We're learning. I slept in my old room. Childhood had been boxed and labeled, but the smell of wood polish and afternoon sun remained. In the middle of the night, the house shifted like a body finding a better position. I lay awake and thought about the man in the photograph by the tree, the stranger whose 6 words had become our family's liturgy. Somewhere, he had decided to hand generosity down the line. He would never meet Noah or Ms. Rivera or the veteran or the librarian. He would never read the joke taped to the hardware wall or hear the town hum its song. Still, he had pushed the first domino with a sentence and a tree. Morning wove its gold into the curtains. Coffee clicked again in the old pot. Mom slid a mug across the counter the way love does when it doesn't expect applause. Are you going back to the lot? She asked. I'm going on, I said. But I'll pass through. Rachel came downstairs carrying 2 boxes. Take these ledgers, she said. Keep the margins loud. She hesitated. And take me if you can. For a day. I want to see it from your seat. We drove with windows cracked enough to let the world smell like itself. The road did not fuss. At the lot, the sail lifted its chin to wind and the chalkboard wore new math like jewelry. A woman I didn't know was explaining ratios to a child with jelly on his face, and both of them acted as if Ratio was a cousin who visited often. People waved and did not stare. That's how you know you belong. People look at you and then keep doing what matters. Rachel stood still in the middle and turned slowly, like a compass confirming something. She put her hand on a bench and then sat and then stood to help a man wrestle a table leg into sense. She laughed at a joke that cost nothing and added a pan of brownies to a table already overfed. She did not check her phone. She did not announce. She practiced. I found a piece of chalk and wrote on the corner of the board, very small, count chairs. Someone underlined it. Someone else circled it. A kid added in names. I nodded. He is already dangerous in the good way. At noon a truck pulled in. Not a delivery, a pilgrimage. A man stepped down with knees that had negotiated with stairs for decades. He looked at the sign, then at me, then passed me to the sail that made shade out of intention. You the one who opened this? He asked. No, I said. The town did. He grinned like the sun had drawn a line across his face and signed his name. Name's Ezra, he said. I knew a man once who talked about trees the way other men talk about profit. I waited without touching the moment. Hands ruin things sometimes. He gave me 6 words when I had nothing but a coat and a bad reputation, he said. Told me to go find the tree that remembered me before I made mistakes and wait there until I could be somebody else. I sat 3 days, then stood up and went to work. Built porches until my hands forgot how to steal. He laughed once, a soft correction. Guess I'm owing a thank you very late. What was his name? I asked, the edges of the world pulling themselves into focus. Didn't say, he answered. But he wore a watch like it mattered and a face that looked relieved. Said a man had done the same for him once and he was paying interest. I closed my eyes just long enough to place a prayer somewhere useful. When I opened them, Ezra was studying the benches the way carpenters study regrets. You got a bad angle on that joint, he said without judgment. Want me to show you an old trick that makes new mistakes behave? Please, I said. He taught with the patience of those who learned learning late. He fixed the joint, then the way I held the drill, then the shame I didn't know I was carrying for not knowing things already. Tools don't judge, he said. They only tell the truth about pressure. By evening, he told half his story and heard a dozen others. He ate stew that had traveled farther than some marriages and wiped his bowl with bread like a person who doesn't believe in waste. Before he left, he pressed a piece of paper into my palm. On it a drawing, a tree with a split trunk and a key under the north root. I draw it everywhere I go, he said. Keeps me straight. I put the drawing in the ledger. You kept the words alive, I said. That's wealth. He nodded. Hard to spend, though. Only if you count it wrong. He laughed and walked toward a truck that had learned loyalty. Rachel stood behind me, quiet and full. That was him, she whispered. The original. Maybe, I said. Or maybe just another branch. We watched his taillights fade. The lot moved softly around us, like a heart that has learned to beat for more than one person at a time. As the sky turned the color of mercy, the librarian from our old town stepped out from behind a minivan like a plot twist that gives the ending permission. She'd driven down with a box of books she didn't want to catalog because they belonged to hands, not shelves. She handed me one with a green cover, thin as certainty, and said, "Read page 30 aloud when the day argues with you." I did. It was a poem about tables growing legs even when people forgot to build them. It used plain words and left room for breath. When I finished, a child clapped once, decisively, as if poems were carpentry that passed inspection. He wasn't wrong. Mom arrived later with 2 casseroles and a towel over her shoulder like a sash of office. She kissed both my cheeks and Rachel's and then kissed the air near the chalkboard for anyone who needed a blessing. People made room without being asked. She sat between strangers and told a story about me at 5, insisting my dollhouses have ramps because dolls have knees that get tired too. I pretended I didn't hear. She did not let me. We stayed until the dark made decisions. String lights, our small stars, held up their end of the bargain. The lot looked like a celebration that had learned to tidy up after itself. I walked the boundary one more time with the compass in my pocket and the key under my skin and felt the road hum in the soles of my shoes. Rachel touched my arm. "You're leaving again tomorrow." "Yes," I said. "Where?" "Where the chairs aren't counted yet." She nodded. "I'll keep counting here." We stood there like the last 2 musicians packing up after everyone else had gone home, satisfied by echoes. Mom hugged us both and whispered a line that sounded suspiciously like prayer and instruction. "Don't be stingy with your goodbyes. They're part of the gift." Night laid itself gently over the lot. A breeze lifted the sail and put it down again like a parent settling a blanket on a child who fell asleep in a car. I wrote one more sentence in the ledger. Today the road came to us and asked for a chair. We gave it 2. Back at the car, I found a note under the wiper the way kind towns leave you reasons to stay. In a hand I didn't know. I heard about a school in a county 2 hours east where the roof argues with rain and winds only sometimes. They can't pay but they bake. If you go, take someone with you who laughs easily. The roof prefers it. I smiled and looked at Rachel. She raised her hand like a child who finally knows the answer and is unafraid of being seen. I nodded. "We leave at dawn," I said. She grinned, then sobered a little. "Elle, do you ever worry you'll run out of whatever this is?" I thought about the tree, the tape, the man named Ezra, the poem on page 30, the boy in the diner, the girl with jelly ratios, the veteran's compass pointing to stubbornness, the jasmine that keeps saying yes. "No," I said. "It multiplies when spent." That's the math he meant. We got in the car. The lot receded in the mirror and did not diminish. Ahead, the road lengthened like an invitation with RSVP already checked. I drove in silence for a while, letting the world write its own sentences. Then softly, not to the road but to the night that owns it, I said what I had been practicing since the study, since the tree, since the letters, since the lot. "Find the tree," I whispered. "It's waiting still." Rachel leaned her head against the window and smiled. "We will." The highway agreed by making room, and the compass, faithful traitor to north, tugged toward the next necessary place. Dawn made a narrow path out of the dark and we took it. The highway was quiet enough to hear the tires decide what kind of day they wanted. Rachel dozed with her head against the window and a smile on her face like a decision. I drove in the soft hour when the world resets without bragging about it. The compass in the console twitched slightly, the way it does when stubbornness is near. 2 hours east. The roofs told on themselves from a distance. You can tell when wood has learned to sag politely to keep from embarrassing anyone. The school sat low to the road, a rectangle that had once believed it could be a ship. A hand-painted sign out front used 3 different blues and meant it. On the steps, a woman waved with the whole arm, not because we were far, but because welcome travels faster when it's big. You must be Elise, she said. And you must be whoever Elise brings. Rachel grinned and offered both hands as if the woman might choose, and she took both as if she didn't want to. Inside, the hall smelled like crayons and time. The roof protested above the library with a rhythm I recognized. Drip, pause, decide, drip. Buckets stood like volunteers losing a fight. The woman introduced herself as Principal Hart, a name that had clearly earned itself. We called 3 companies, she said, embarrassed for reasons that didn't belong to her. They said the fix costs more than our year. She said year like a person who has learned to stretch a month until it apologizes. Roof first, I said. Stories later. Rachel set up a table without asking permission and somehow made it look official. She laid out thermoses and napkins and the kind of cookies that remember every bake sale. She asked Principal Hart to make a list that started with supplies and ended with music. Because, Rachel said, we work better to be treated. The tar complained but cooperated. Nails argued and then yielded. Rachel held the beam with the kind of strength that doesn't ask to be admired and laughed when a clump of dust decided to become her new hat. Children watched from below like birds who had made peace with gravity. One boy raised his hand even though no one had asked a question. Do you get paid to fix it? He shouted. I looked down and said, in cookies and stories that go somewhere. He nodded like wages now made sense. By noon, the worst of the drip had been convinced to rejoin the weather outside. We came down to applause we did not deserve and ate stew in paper bowls that wanted to buckle but remembered their duty. A teacher with ink on her wrist asked if we would look at the back door. It had learned to stick on test days, and she wanted children to believe freedom wasn't conditional. We planed it until the frame remembered its geometry and swung without negotiation. A little girl pushed it open and shut 7 times like she was rehearsing for a life where obstacles took turns. In the hallway, a bulletin board held faded photographs and fresh drawings. In the corner, a narrow frame leaned against the wall like a tired truth, a picture of a tree split near the root, ocean behind it like a faithful rumor. On the bottom mat, in handwriting I knew the shape of without having seen it, find the tree. It's waiting still. The letters were traced in pencil by someone who had wanted to learn the curve before they believed the sentence. I reached out and touched the glass. It was cool and present. Rachel stood beside me without speaking. Principal Hart followed my eyes. That was here when I took the job, she said. Came from the old principal's office when they cleaned it out. He never said where it was from, just that teachers who forget who they are should stare at it until they remember. Do you? I asked. Not always, she said, but the picture never gets tired so we take turns. The light shifted through the windows, and the library became a softer place to keep books. Rachel gathered children at tables and handed out scrap wood and sandpaper, and asked them to smooth edges until they could rub their palms without collecting splinters. That's what school is, she told them. We make each other less likely to cut someone we love. They nodded and took it seriously in the way children know how to do when you treat wisdom like a job they already hold. We patched the roof all afternoon, then moved to a classroom where the heater coughed resentments. The janitor joined us in quiet shoes and told us the names of every pipe and wire, like family. He had a way of talking to equipment that made it confess. He and Rachel rewired a switch and asked it to be more reliable. It agreed, if only because their hands were tired and it wanted to be useful. At sunset, the school held a dinner in the cafeteria, the kind where nobody sits alone unless they want to. A boy in a paper crown stood on a chair and announced that he could now spell necessary without looking. Everyone clapped because there are some victories that deserve an audience even if they won't fit on a resume. The custodian's wife pressed containers of lasagna into our hands and told us to eat on the road because the road gets jealous if you ignore it too long. Outside, the sky practiced being gentle. Principal Hart hugged us like she'd practiced too. If it leaks again, she said, we have buckets and confidence. Also, my husband found YouTube. We laughed. She whispered, you'll be back? as a favor to the part of herself still learning how to knead. I will pass through, I said. And I will not be the only one. She nodded like a person who has finally met the difference between promises and plans. We drove into night as if it had never been anything else. Rachel dozed again, then woke and stared out the window at trees that refused to be identical. I thought money was the loudest thing in our family, she said. Turns out it was silence. Silence can be a language if you teach it manners, I said. We used it to listen. Now we use it less. She looked at me, then at the road, then at the compass resting in the cup holder, its needle unfaithful to north, loyal to need. I want one, she said. You have one, I said. It's your hands. We passed a sign for a town with a name that sounded like a lullaby. I took the exit without checking why. The car likes adventure more when it doesn't have to argue. We stopped at a small park where benches kept secrets and a merry-go-round tried not to be dizzy. The night air wore spring and the leftover weight of winter like a shawl. On the table, someone had left a note in a careful child's script. We will be here at noon with a plan. Underneath were drawings of tools and a cake and a cat. The cat looked in charge. We slept in the car because sometimes cheap and holy are the same thing. In the morning, children arrived with their parents, and the plan did not disappoint. They wanted a box for swapping books, a chalkboard for ideas, a corner for worries people could put down if they were tired of carrying them. Rachel set up a banner and chose a color the sky agreed with. I measured posts with a boy who spelled necessary like a secret and a girl who measured twice because her grandmother had taught her to be patient where wood is concerned and impatient where kindness is concerned. By noon, the box stood on 4 legs and the chalkboard stood on 2. And the corner for worries already held 3 folded papers no one had to read to feel better. We ate cake with that cat watching as if we were finally learning how to behave. A man with a rundown truck offered extra paint. A woman offered a poem about benches. We gave them both yes and watched as the word made them taller. We stayed 3 days. Not because the job demanded it, but because leaving without seeing the first book trade felt like breaking a promise we hadn't made but meant anyway. When a girl in a yellow coat placed a book about trees in the box and took one about tides, I felt the day lock into place. On the 3rd night, sitting on the curb with our backs against the new book box, Rachel said, I used to rehearse my answers before walking into rooms. Now I rehearse my questions. What changed? I asked. I stopped trying to be proof, she said. I started trying to be a door. We drove again at dawn and the compass cheered. The road laid itself out like a map drawn by calligraphy, deliberate, graceful, no erasures. At a rest stop with trees that had decided rest didn't require improvement, we found a small table with a plaque. Not a dedication, a sentence. This table belongs to whoever is tired. I ran my hand across the grain and left nothing behind but oil and gratitude. Rachel took a photo and didn't post it anywhere. Some things prefer to be true without being applauded. The lot called again in the afternoon, that familiar hum rising from a distance. We pulled in and found a class already in session. Ezra stood at the chalkboard demonstrating the angle trick with a triangle a child had drawn wrong and then right, and he was praising both. The librarian had brought books about trees, and tapes about singing and proven both were good for rooms where children pace. Ms. Rivera had sent jars of jasmine starts with their names written on tape. Believe, peace, tomato. The veteran pointed at a map where lines connected towns that had not met but were already acquainted. Noah stood, older by months, steadier by practice, the ledger under his arm like a small animal he knew how to feed. He hugged us as if practice had taught him to hold what leaves and still be kind to what stays. He showed me the page where the lot had started calling itself a school without a meeting. He'd added columns I didn't think of, borrowed and returned. After returned, he'd drawn little stars. The stars were many. We sat under the sail and listened to the road think. I rested my head against the post and read from the teacher's book. Page 30 again because it still worked. Rachel fell asleep with one hand over her face and the other on her stomach like she was keeping laughter from escaping early. A child named Alma crawled into my lap without permission and fell asleep too because permission floors trust when it arrives in the wrong order. At dusk, town gathered without expecting speeches. Music happened the way it happens when someone starts and someone else refuses to leave them alone. A line formed at the chalkboard where people wrote things they needed and things they had, and arrows sprouted between the lists like roots finding water. We brought out more chairs and then more and then stopped counting. Nobody was left standing unless standing was what they wanted. In the middle of that good noise, Tom appeared at the edge of the lot with a grin already spent. He handed me a small package wrapped in brown paper and said, "From a woman at a diner who pours coffee like absolution. She said you'd know." I held it like an eggshell and unwrapped it as if paper had feelings. Inside, a folded napkin with 6 words in ink that had traveled. "Find the tree. It's waiting still." Underneath, a photograph of a hand I recognized by a scar I had never seen, holding a key near a root that pointed north. On the back, one line, "Pass it on without ceremony." I did not cry. I nodded and pressed the napkin flat on the table, and Rachel set a glass over it like a frame. We stayed late and then later until the lights were greedy. Ezra told the story of the first porch he ever built twice, and it was good both times. The veteran played a song on a harmonica that pretended to be shy. The librarian laughed like punctuation. The lot glowed from the inside, the way places do when the people who occupy them remembered how. We left when leaving was the same as staying because both meant carrying. The road didn't need our headlights to know where it was going, but it humored us anyway. The moon held court and the trees pledged allegiance without pretending to be still. Rachel leaned back and watched the world move in reverse out her window, calm in the knowledge that forward is a matter of intention as much as direction. At the county line, the car clicked and I pulled into a turnout that wasn't a place so much as a pause. A bench stood facing nothing because nothing needed the attention. We sat and said nothing worthy of quotation. The air held the day without asking for payment. I pulled the ledger from the bag and wrote quietly, "Today I learned the difference between building and becoming. Building ends. Becoming does not." Rachel read over my shoulder and did not correct my handwriting. "Mom says she's making soup for anyone who rings the bell," she said. "She says the door swings better since we planed it. She says she keeps forgetting and then the door reminds her." "The good kind of forgetting," I said. She nodded. "You'll keep going?" "Yes." "And I'll keep the light?" "Yes." "Will we meet at the same table again?" "We always do." We drove the last hour in peace. When we reached the cabin, the tree stood as if it had been waiting without impatience. The door opened with its usual gentle argument and welcomed us like loyalty. The box of letters on the table had shifted imperceptibly in the way paper settles into knowing. I added my newest pages beside his oldest ones and felt no anxiety about the order. Time is polite when purpose is present. I slept with the window open and the night entered as a guest who wipes their feet. The wind told the leaves the day's news. I dreamt not of money counting itself, not of wills being read aloud, not of marble and keys and appraisals. I dreamt of tables, of benches, of chalk dust and jasmine, of roofs that stopped lying and doors that learned generosity, of a napkin with 6 words crossing counties until it found someone too tired to argue. I woke just before the sun surprised the line of the horizon and knew a truth deeper than any ledger could catch. I was not finishing anything. I was returning everything I had been given to a place where more hands could find it. I stood, wrapped a sweater around work that didn't care what I wore, and stepped out to the tree. The bark was rough faith. The trunk old certainty. I pressed my forehead to it and said the only prayer that's worked since the first letter, "Give me good hands and a softer tongue." The tree did not answer. Didn't need to. Down the path, the town stretched and yawned and began again. Somewhere a kettle argued toward bravery. Somewhere a child tied shoes. Somewhere a roof kept its promise. Somewhere far a lot held a meeting without minutes. Somewhere I hadn't yet stood. A table wobbled and waited for me or for someone I had already taught to go. I went inside, left the door unlocked in quiet defiance of fear, packed the hammer, the compass, the ledgers, the napkin under the glass. The jasmine start with the label Believe. I wrote a note on the table for Noah in case he arrived wanted. The way young men arrive when they have decided to be necessary. Take whatever makes you brave. Leave whatever makes you kinder. Count chairs. Count names. Count on the light. I tucked the key under the north root this time. I did it mindfully, my palm flat to the earth after. The way you press love into a shoulder when the only thing you can say is I know. Then I stood. The road didn't call. It simply waited. Good roads do. I closed the door without locking it, touched the wood where countless hands had learned the protocols of coming and going, and walked toward the sound the day makes when it has worked for you and refuses to pretend otherwise. I didn't look back. I didn't have to. Back had followed me. And ahead, the light didn't ask for a switch. It glowed like a promise someone else had already kept. They got millions at Grandpa's funeral. I got one plane ticket and 6 words that wouldn't let me sleep the same again. I found the tree. I found the town. I found the work. And when I left the door unlocked and the key under the north route, because what he gave me was never meant to be mine alone. If you're tired, find your tree. It's waiting still.